I woke up freezing. Salt on my lips. Someone's coat over me. Hours earlier I'd laughed at seasickness warnings on a squid boat. Then the deck tilted. My stomach turned. The world went black. When I opened my eyes, a stranger's hands were steadying my head. She smelled like diesel, rope, and cold Atlantic wind. All night she never left my side. Not once. By sunrise I knew something in me had already changed. I just didn't know yet how much it would cost me. My name is Samantha Whitfield, and I never expected a fishing boat off the coast of Maine to rearrange the entire shape of my life that October. I came to Port Loyal chasing a magazine assignment about vanishing fishing towns, armed with a notebook, a recorder, and no idea what I was walking into. The harbor smelled like brine and diesel. Gulls screaming overhead as I climbed aboard the Marisol under a bruised purple sky before dawn. Captain Russo introduced me to his crew in clipped sentences, saving one name for last, nodding toward a woman coiling rope with quiet efficiency. Joe Alvarez barely looked up when we shook hands, just studied me like she was already predicting how badly this trip would go. I told her I was writing about the squid fleet, about families who'd fished these waters for generations, hoping to sound less like a tourist. She said nothing, just handed me a life vest and told me to stay out of the way once the nets went out. An hour into open water, the swells grew, and my stomach began a slow, terrible negotiation I was clearly about to lose badly. I gripped the rail, jaw tight, pride the only thing keeping me upright while the deck rose and fell beneath my useless legs. Joe noticed before I said a word, crouching beside me with a bottle of water and an expression that wasn't quite sympathy. Not yet. You're the greenest thing I've seen on this boat in years, she said. And somehow it didn't feel like an insult at all. The last thing I remember was the horizon spinning sideways, her hand grabbing my arm before my knees gave out completely beneath me. I woke wrapped in a wool blanket that smelled like her, my head resting against a coiled net she'd arranged like a pillow. Easy now, she said, voice low. Don't sit up yet. You fainted hard enough to scare half this crew half to death. I tried to apologize, embarrassed beyond words, but she just handed me crackers and told me seasickness wasn't a character flaw, only bad luck. She stayed close the rest of that night, checking on me between hauls, never making a show of it, never asking for thanks. By the time we docked at dawn, I'd learned her name meant nothing to her without the C attached. Fishing since she was 12. I should have gone home and written my article, but instead I found myself back at the harbor the following evening. Notebook forgotten. Joe raised an eyebrow when she saw me waiting by the dock, arms crossed, asking if I'd come back for more punishment. I told her I needed better material, which was half true. The other half something I wasn't ready to name out loud yet. She let me ride along again, this time handing me ginger candy before we even left the harbor, already anticipating my weakness. We talked between hauls about her father, who'd taught her every knot, and her mother, who'd hoped she'd choose an easier life instead. I told her about growing up in Boston, about a career I'd built on being competent and composed, never quite belonging anywhere fully. She laughed at something I said, a real laugh, sudden and unguarded, and I realized I'd been trying to earn that sound all night. There was something steady about her, unbothered by cold or exhaustion, like the ocean had worn away everything unnecessary in her long ago. I started noticing details I had no professional reason to notice, the calluses on her hands, the way she squinted toward weather before radios confirmed it. After the third trip, Captain Russo teased that Joe had never let a reporter ride the Marisol twice, let alone 4 times running. Joe didn't deny it, just shrugged and said I was persistent, and persistent people deserved a fair chance to prove themselves useful. One night, becalmed between hauls, she taught me to identify constellations, her shoulder brushing mine as she traced patterns across the dark sky. Forgot, for whole stretches of time, that I was supposed to be working, that this was research, that I had a deadline waiting. She asked, once, carefully, if there was someone waiting for me back in Boston, and something in her voice made the question feel important. I said no, and watched her expression shift slightly, something unreadable passing behind her eyes before she turned back toward the nets. I began writing less about squid quotas and more about her hands, her silences, the particular way she watched storms roll in from the west. My editor emailed asking for a draft, and I realized I'd filled 3 notebooks with Joe Alvarez and barely a paragraph on fishing economics. One evening she invited me to her house for dinner, a small blue cottage near the water, cluttered with nets and old photographs. Her grandmother's rosary hung by the door, and a black and white photo of 2 women on a boat, unlabeled, faded, oddly familiar somehow. I asked about the photo, and Joe went quiet, saying only that it was her great-aunt, and changing the subject before I could push further. We ate chowder at her kitchen table, and for the first time all week, neither of us mentioned fishing, deadlines, or the article at all. When I left that night, she walked me to my car, and for one long second neither of us moved to say goodbye first. I drove back to my rental replaying that second on a loop, furious at myself for reading meaning into something that was probably nothing. The next morning she texted, unprompted, just a photo of sunrise over the harbor. No caption. And I stared at it far too long. I told myself this was just friendship, small-town hospitality toward an outsider. Even as my chest did something inconvenient every time my phone buzzed. We started spending time on land too, walking the rocky shoreline, her pointing out tide pools like they held secrets worth protecting carefully. She told me about a woman she'd loved once, years ago, who left for the city and never looked back, never explained why. I told her about the boyfriends I dated to feel normal, relationships that fit neatly on paper but left something in me permanently unfed. Neither of us said the obvious thing, but the air between us had changed, thick with something we were both too careful to name. One foggy afternoon, sheltering under the dock from sudden rain, our hands brushed reaching for the same rope, and neither of us pulled away. She looked at me like she was asking permission, and I realized, terrifyingly, that I wanted to give it more than I'd wanted anything. I kissed her first, quick and clumsy, salt water dripping from both our jackets, my heart slamming against my ribs like a warning bell. She kissed me back slower, steadier, like she'd been waiting patiently for me to catch up to something she'd already decided long ago. We stood there in the rain for a long time, not speaking, just holding on to each other like the storm might sweep one of us away. That night I couldn't write a single word of my article, just sat on my bed replaying every second, terrified and impossibly happy at once. Joe texted late, asking if this was real or just the ocean air making fools of us both, and I answered honestly, terrified either way. I told her it was real, that I hadn't felt this certain about anything in years, and she sent back a single word, good. We started seeing each other properly after that. Quiet dinners, long walks, careful hand-holding when we were sure no one from town could see. I extended my assignment twice, telling my editor I needed more time, while privately knowing I simply couldn't imagine leaving Port Loyal yet. Joe introduced me, cautiously, as her friend from Boston, and I understood the caution wasn't shame, just survival learned the hard way over years. I asked about her family, and she admitted her mother suspected the truth about her for years, but had never once said it aloud. Some nights we sat on her porch watching the harbor lights, saying almost nothing, comfortable in a silence I'd never known with anyone before. I started to imagine a version of my life that included this town, this woman, this slower rhythm I hadn't known I was craving. Joe taught me to mend nets, laughing when my fingers fumbled, patient in a way that made the lesson feel like something else entirely. For the first time in years, I stopped performing competence and just let myself be clumsy, uncertain, and genuinely happy in front of someone. She told me she hadn't let herself want anything this much since her fiancé. Elena. Drowned in a storm nearly 6 years earlier. The word fiancé landed heavy between us, and suddenly her guardedness, her caution, made unbearable, aching sense in a way I hadn't understood before. I held her that night without asking for details, letting her decide what to share. Understanding grief needed space more than curiosity ever did. Falling for Joe felt like stepping onto a boat I'd never sailed before. Thrilling and unsteady, and I was finally ready to trust the water. My editor called demanding the finished article, reminding me the magazine's angle was economic decline, not a love letter to a fishing town. I hadn't told him the real reason I kept delaying. That finishing meant deciding whether to stay in Port Loyal or leave Joe behind. My mother called that same week, asking when I'd finally settled down, mentioning a colleague's son she thought I should meet for dinner. I hadn't come out to my parents yet, and every unanswered question about my life in Maine felt like a lie stacking on another lie. Joe noticed I went quiet after that call, and asked gently if my family knew about her, about us, about any of this at all. I admitted they didn't, and watched something close slightly in her expression, an old wound reopening faster than I could explain myself. She said she understood hiding. She'd done it for years, but she couldn't be someone's secret forever. Not again. Not after Elena. I promised her it wasn't about shame, only fear. But the words felt thin even as I said them, unconvincing to both of us. Word started spreading in Port Loyal anyway, small towns being what they are. And Joe's brother Tomas confronted her outside the harbor one morning. He wasn't cruel, just worried, asking if she understood what people would say, what it might do to the families standing on the docks. Joe told him she was done apologizing for who she loved, but I could see how much the confrontation had cost her afterward. My magazine editor discovered, through a leaked draft, that the fishing quota story I'd been assigned doubled as an economic case for closing the dock. I hadn't realized the full scope of the piece, that my research could be used to justify federal funding cuts to small fishing communities. When Joe found out what my article might actually do to Port Loyal's fishing industry, her expression turned into something I'd never seen before. "You used me for material," she said, voice shaking, "while your magazine builds a case to shut down the only life I've ever known." I tried to explain I hadn't known, that my editor had reframed my research without permission, but the explanation felt hollow even to me. She said trust was the one thing she couldn't afford to be wrong about again, not after everything, and walked away without looking back. I spent that night alone in my rental, staring at my notes, realizing how easily good intentions could still cause devastating, irreversible harm. My editor pushed harder, unaware of the wreckage, insisting the piece needed to run within 2 weeks to meet the quarterly deadline schedule. I called my mother, desperate for something steady, and finally told her the truth about Joe, my voice breaking somewhere in the middle. There was a long silence on the line, longer than I could bear, before she asked quietly if this was why I'd sounded different lately. She didn't say what I feared most, but she didn't say the words I needed either. Just told me she needed time to think. I hung up feeling more alone than I had in years, caught between a career, family, and a woman who wouldn't answer my texts. Tomas came to my rental unexpectedly, not to threaten me, but to ask honestly whether I actually cared about his sister or just her story. I told him the truth, that I loved her, that the article was never supposed to hurt anyone, and I intended to fix it somehow. He said intentions didn't rebuild docks or replace lost income, and that Joe had already lost too much to risk trusting the wrong person again. I went to the harbor looking for Joe, but she'd taken the Marisol out alone, refusing radio calls, refusing everyone, including her own crew. Captain Russo told me she did this sometimes, disappeared into open water when something broke inside her that land couldn't fix quickly enough. I waited on the dock for hours, rehearsing apologies that all sounded inadequate against what my article had actually threatened to destroy. When she finally returned at dusk, exhausted, salt-crusted, She looked at me like she wasn't sure I was worth the energy of another argument. I told her I'd already called my editor demanding changes, but she said demanding wasn't the same as guaranteeing anything would actually change. She asked if I would choose Port Loyal over my career if it came down to that. And I hesitated a second too long to answer. That hesitation said more than any words could have. And she nodded slowly, like she'd expected exactly that answer all along. I don't need someone who loves me and my hesitation both, she said. And left me standing on the dock with nothing to say back. For 3 days we didn't speak. And Port Loyal felt smaller than ever. Every street corner holding a memory I couldn't outrun anymore. My mother called again. This time saying she'd talked to my father. And they wanted to understand. Even if understanding took them longer than expected. It wasn't full acceptance. But it wasn't rejection either. And for the first time I let myself believe my family might eventually come around. I drafted a new version of the article, centering the fishermen's voices instead of quotas, hoping it might undo some of the damage done. My editor rejected it outright, saying it didn't fit the magazine's investigative angle, and threatened to run the original version without my consent. I threatened to pull my byline entirely, risking a career I'd spent a decade building. Something I'd never done for anyone before Joe. He backed down, reluctantly, giving me one final week to prove the human story could stand on its own without the economic framing. I brought the new draft to Joe, hands shaking, asking her to read it before I sent anything anywhere, needing her trust more than approval. She read it slowly on her porch, silent for a long time, before saying quietly that it sounded like she recognized herself in it finally. It's not enough to fix everything, she said. But it's a start. And starts were something she understood better than most people ever could. I asked if that meant there was still a chance for us, and she said chances required more than good articles. They required staying. I told her I wanted to stay, not just for her, but because Port Loyal had started to feel like the first real home I'd chosen. She wasn't ready to fully believe me yet. And I understood that trust, once broken, couldn't be repaired by words alone, only by time. My editor finally approved the revised piece, though he warned my career trajectory at the magazine would likely stall because of the softer angle. I told him I could live with that, surprising myself with how easily the words came out. How little that fear mattered anymore. Joe agreed to one more conversation, meeting me at the harbor at sunset. Both of us aware this exchange might decide everything between us. I apologized again, fully, without excuses, and told her I understood if trusting me again felt impossible after everything that had happened. She looked out at the water for a long moment before saying quietly that impossible and unlikely weren't always the same thing. Not always. We agreed to try again slowly. No promises. Just small steady steps. Like relearning to walk on a deck after a long illness. The article published 2 weeks later. And to my relief, it drew national attention to Port Loyal's fishing community instead of condemning it. Letters poured in from readers, several offering donations toward equipment repairs, a few even proposing partnerships with sustainable fishing cooperatives upstate. Joe read every letter twice, disbelief slowly softening into something like hope, something she admitted she hadn't allowed herself in years. Tomas apologized to me at the dock, awkwardly, saying he'd misjudged my intentions, and that the town owed me more gratitude than suspicion now. For a while, things felt almost easy, Joe and I settling into a rhythm neither of us had dared imagine during those difficult weeks. Then my magazine offered me a permanent staff position in Boston, a promotion I'd worked toward for years, contingent on relocating within the month. I didn't tell Joe immediately, terrified of what accepting might mean, terrified equally of what refusing might cost the career I'd built. She found out anyway. From Tomas, who'd heard it secondhand at the harbor, and her face when she confronted me was pure betrayal again. You were going to leave without telling me, she said. And I realized my silence had already answered a question I hadn't meant to answer. I tried explaining I hadn't decided yet, that I was scared. But she said scared wasn't an excuse for choosing silence over honesty twice. That night alone, I finally admitted to myself that Boston represented safety, familiarity, everything I knew how to navigate without real risk. Port Loyal represented something else entirely, uncertain and unproven, a life built on love instead of resume lines and career momentum. My mother, surprisingly, told me to stop treating happiness like a risk assessment, that she wished she'd taken fewer safe choices herself. Long ago, she mentioned, almost in passing, that my great-aunt Ruth had loved a woman once, decades earlier, and the family had simply never spoken of it. I asked why nobody ever told me, and my mother said some silences get inherited before anyone decides consciously to keep them going. That conversation cracked something open in me, a quiet grief for a woman I'd never known, who'd never gotten to choose openly like I could. I drove to Port Loyal that same night, unannounced, needing to see Joe before I could think myself out of the decision forming inside me. She wasn't home, and Tomas told me she'd taken the Marisol out again, alone, into water that was already showing signs of a coming storm. The harbor radio crackled with weather warnings, small craft advisories turning urgent, and something in my chest turned cold with sudden fear. Captain Russo tried calling her repeatedly, getting no response, and admitted the storm forming offshore was worse than any forecast had predicted. I begged him to take another boat out looking for her, and he agreed, though his expression told me he understood the danger clearly. We left the harbor as rain turned sideways,
Warf es rising fast?
Visibility dropping until the horizon disappeared into one indistinguishable gray wall. I gripped the rail, this time not from seasickness but from terror, scanning the churning water for any sign of the Marisol's lights. After what felt like hours, we spotted her. Engine dead. Taking on water. Joe fighting alone against a sea that had already taken someone from her once. Russo maneuvered close as I threw a line toward the Marisol, shouting her name into wind that swallowed the sound almost instantly. Joe caught the line. Exhausted. Soaked through. And I realized this was the same woman who'd once held me steady through my own storm. Getting her aboard was chaos. Freezing hands and screaming wind. But I refused to let go of her arm even once during the transfer. Once she was safe, wrapped in blankets exactly like she'd once wrapped me, I finally let myself shake, adrenaline giving way to raw relief. She looked at me, lips blue with cold, and asked, half laughing, half crying, if I'd come all this way just to save her life. I told her I'd come to say I was choosing her, choosing Port Loyal, and the timing had simply turned out more dramatic than planned. She laughed, then cried harder, saying she'd been so afraid of losing someone else to the water that she'd almost pushed me away first. We didn't finish that conversation until we were both dry, wrapped in blankets at her cottage, the storm still howling outside the windows. I told her about my mother's confession, about Ruth, about generations of women who never got to choose out loud like I finally could. Joe said maybe that was the point of all this, choosing loudly enough for the ones who never got the chance to choose at all. I called my editor the next morning and turned down the Boston position, my voice steadier than I expected it to feel, saying it. He was disappointed but not entirely surprised, admitting he'd noticed something different in my writing since I'd started covering Port Loyal months earlier. Joe's mother invited me to Sunday dinner for the first time, a small gesture that felt enormous after everything we'd survived to reach it. She was quiet and watchful throughout the meal, but at the door she squeezed my hand and told me to take care of her daughter. I told her I intended to, for as long as Joe would let me, and something in her expression finally, fully relaxed. My mother asked, tentatively, if she and my father could visit Port Loyal sometime, see this life I kept describing in every phone call. I said yes immediately, surprised by how much I wanted them to see it, to see her, to understand the shape my happiness had taken. Jo was nervous meeting them. More nervous than I'd ever seen her on open water during the worst storms of the season. My father, gruff and quiet by nature, spent an hour asking Jo about squid migration patterns, which turned out to be his version of approval. My mother cried a little at dinner, admitting she wished Ruth had lived to see a version of the family that could finally say things aloud. Tomas and Jo repaired their strained relationship slowly, him showing up more at the cottage, teasing me about my improved sea legs. The town slowly stopped treating us as gossip and started treating us as simply another couple among many at the harbor's small community events. I found freelance work covering coastal communities up and down the eastern seaboard, keeping my career alive without leaving the life I'd chosen. Jo taught me to captain a small boat that spring, patient through every mistake, proud in a way that still makes my chest ache. We spent the anniversary of Elena's death together quietly, Jo finally able to speak about her without the old flinch of unbearable grief. She told me grief and love could finally coexist in her without canceling each other out, and I understood exactly what she meant by that. One evening on the porch, watching gulls circle the harbor, Jo said quietly that she'd never expected healing to arrive wearing seasickness and a notebook. A year after that first terrible boat ride, Port Loyal's fishing cooperative held a community celebration, funded partly by the readers my article had reached. Jo was asked to speak, something she'd never done publicly before, her hands shaking slightly as she stepped up to the small wooden platform. She spoke about her father, about Elena, about nearly losing herself to grief before a seasick reporter fell sideways into her life uninvited. The crowd laughed, warm and easy, and I felt my face flush watching the whole town smile at a story that used to feel unspeakable. Then she said something I hadn't expected, thanking the town for finally letting her love someone openly, without apology, without hiding, without fear. My mother, standing beside me, squeezed my hand tightly, and I realized she'd flown in without telling me, just to witness this moment. After the speech, Jo found me in the crowd, took both my hands, and said she had one more thing she needed to say publicly. She got down on one knee right there on the dock, weathered hands trembling, asking if I'd build the rest of my life alongside hers. I said yes before she even finished the question. The whole harbor erupting into applause, gulls scattering overhead at the sudden noise. Tomas hooped loudest of all, and Captain Russo pretended to wipe something from his eye that definitely wasn't just sea spray. Definitely not. My mother cried openly this time. No hesitation in it. Just pure unfiltered joy for a daughter she'd once worried might never feel this free. That night, walking the shoreline together, Jo told me she'd kept the ring in her boat's toolbox for 3 months, waiting for the right moment. I asked why she waited so long, and she said she wanted to be certain I'd chosen this life fully, not just chosen her impulsively. I told her I'd been certain since the night I woke up wrapped in her coat, though it took me longer to admit it aloud. We decided to marry the following spring, right there at the harbor, surrounded by nets, and the community that had watched us fall in love. My father offered, gruffly, to walk me partway down the dock, admitting he'd never expected to feel so proud watching his daughter choose herself. Jo's mother gave me Elena's old silver bracelet, saying it felt right that it find its way onto someone Jo truly, fully trusted again. I wore it at the wedding, alongside a small photo of my great-aunt Ruth, tucked into my bouquet. A quiet tribute to silence finally broken. The ceremony was small, salt-scented, unglamorous in exactly the way that felt right for two women who'd found each other through storms, literal and otherwise. Captain Russo officiated, having gotten ordained online specifically for the occasion, mangling half the ceremony but making everyone laugh through happy tears anyway. When Jo and I said our vows, I promised to never again choose silence over honesty, remembering exactly how close that mistake once came to costing everything. She promised to keep letting herself be loved, even when grief whispered that safety meant staying guarded. alone, and closed off from happiness. Afterward, the whole dock became a celebration. Fishermen and their families dancing under string lights. Plates of chowder passed hand to hand. I caught my mother talking quietly with Joe's mother. The two of them laughing about something. Two women who'd both learned lessons about love late. Later that night, Joe and I stood at the end of the dock, looking out at water that had once nearly taken everything from both of us. She said the ocean had given her grief and love in equal measure, and she'd finally stopped resenting it for demanding both. I told her the ocean had given me something I never knew I was missing. Place. Person. A version of myself I finally recognized. We watched the Marisol rock gently against the dock, and Joe said maybe that boat deserved credit as the actual matchmaker in this whole story. I laughed, agreeing, though I privately credited seasickness more specifically. The humiliating, unglamorous beginning that had somehow led us exactly here. My editor called the next week asking if I'd write a follow-up piece about the wedding, and this time I said yes without hesitation. The follow-up article went further than the first, reaching readers across the country, several writing in about their own long-hidden family stories finally surfacing. Joe said reading those letters felt like proof that choosing honesty rippled outward further than either of us could have predicted that first night. Tomas eventually married too, and at his wedding he thanked Joe publicly for teaching him that love worth having was always worth defending loudly. My great-aunt Ruth's story, once buried under generations of silence, became something my family now spoke about openly, almost proudly. At every holiday gathering, I framed the old photograph from Joe's cottage, the unlabeled one of two women on a boat, and hung it beside our own wedding portrait. Joe said it felt right, letting the past and present sit together on the same wall, no longer separated by shame or unanswered questions. Standing in our small blue cottage that final evening, I realized the seasickness that once humiliated me had somehow delivered me exactly where I belonged. I thought about all the versions of myself that almost left Port Loyal, almost chose silence, almost let fear decide instead of love. None of those versions got to stay, and I was endlessly, quietly grateful that this one, the one who chose honesty over fear, finally did. 2 years later, I still get seasick sometimes, but Joe always has ginger candy ready, and her hand always finds mine before I even ask. We built a life neither of us expected. Honest and hard one. Proof that sometimes the roughest nights at sea lead you exactly home. Fendi.